Check out the full episode of the Bendy Bodies podcast on your favorite podcast app. So I got a particular chuckle when I was reading your book, which I want to show. Hopefully it's not in reverse like it is right now, but hopefully everyone can see that. It's a fantastic book, fantastic podcast by the same name, You Are Not Broken. And I love it in the book early on when you talk about running into an OBGYN friend at ISHWISH, a sexual medicine conference. And she was saying that she also did not receive training in sexual medicine, right? When you asked her why she was there.
Yep.
And I love how you said, well, then who is taking care of the people, sleeping with the people I am giving Viagra to?
Yes. That's the big question.
Yeah, that's the big question. So let's talk about hormones, I think, first, because this is something you talk about a lot on your podcast. You have so much fabulous advice and expertise and information to share on this topic. And so many people struggle because they can't get this information from their gynecologist. So as you discussed on a recent episode, we're kind of stuck with the choice of like going to a regular GYN versus a hormone mill. One of your guests used that term, which I thought was really so accurate. And of course, you talk about that these are brain hormones and not sex hormones. So much advice is, outdated, and we're trying to find this middle ground. How do you suggest people go about that? Because it's just so challenging.
Yeah, well, I think first they should get self-educated, whether that's reading, podcasts, however you like to learn. Because in the traditional insurance-based system now, when you have a 10-minute doctor visit, you don't have time. That's not where education happens anymore. So you really do need to self-advocate and be like, get over your fear of hormones before you go in, because that takes time. The fear for hormones is in the zeitgeist. It's in the ether because of the WHI in 2002. Probably the most damaging thing we did to healthcare and to all humans in the past couple of decades was the dissemination of the WHI. I say we. I was not involved. This was media really portraying a hormone that our body naturally makes as something that's dangerous and something that's trying to kill us. We still see that perpetuated. Many people, because we call breast cancer estrogen positive or progesterone positive. Keep in mind, we could call prostate cancer testosterone positive, but we don't. Right? So it is a nomenclature that I think helps perpetuate the myth. It simply means the cancer has receptors for that type of hormone on it. It doesn't mean that the hormone caused the cancer. Many people don't understand that. And I like to describe hormones like food. Food doesn't cause monsters, but monsters eat food. So when you have a monster, you got to get rid of the food, right? Because people are like, why do you have to get rid of it then if it didn't cause it? It's like, well, because it's food. Get rid of the food, get rid of the monster. Now we can talk about hormones again. So that's, step one is like, don't expect anybody. You have to be comfortable with hormones and the idea of it, because at the end of the day, if you're lucky, you're going to live 40 years past your functioning ovaries. And ultimately, nobody is more in charge of what you're going to do to your body than you.
Yeah. And so many things like, UTIs, you talk a lot about vaginal estrogen and how it's not just useful for having intercourse, but it's also reduces UTIs by like 50%, right? So that's...
Yeah. I mean, a lot of urologists don't know that because the literature is published in the menopause journals. And besides me, not many urologists are reading the menopause journals. Right. So vaginal estrogen is equivalent to anticholinergics, which is kind of the classic bread and butter medication that you're going to be offered for overactive bladder, urgency, frequency, getting up at night, leaking with running water, leaking on the way to the toilet. That's overactive bladder or OAB. So vaginal estrogen is equivalent in efficacy to the anticholinergic medications and doesn't have the bad, nasty side effects of anticholinergics. Plus, it decreases urinary tract infections by 50%. Mm-hmm. And the overactive bladder medications don't do that.
Sure. And you also talk about, not waiting until you have really significant atrophy in the vagina, and people who, this podcast is geared towards people who have connective tissue disorders. Mm-hmm. So they're even more prone towards fragile tissues and things like that. So I think it's so important for people to have access to that kind of therapy. But what about hormones? What about systemic hormones? What should we know about systemic hormones and when they would be most appropriate? And I understand, in this conversation, we could obviously talk about this for many, many, many hours, but just some general information that people might benefit from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so many myths still, right? So what happened after the WHI is women were suffering. And so we tried to make them feel more safe by being like, hey, these are bioidentical. And then that got kind of looped into being compounded, right? And there's these words that people don't actually know what they mean. So it's easy just to break those down. So bioidentical just means the exact same thing that your body makes. So vitamin D, thyroid, insulin, those are all bioidentical. You're just replacing what your body had and lost, right? Versus something synthetic like a antidepressant, a statin, a blood pressure med, right? So most medications are created to help our body, but some are exactly what our body made. And that's what bioidentical means. There are FDA-approved bioidentical hormones that your insurance covers. That's estradiol, progesterone, and testosterone. That's the other big myth, that it has to be expensive, it has to be compounded, it has to be bespoke. No, it doesn't. But there's this big myth that like what we have that's FDA-approved and that insurance covers is somehow not as good as the compounded stuff. Compounded is there. That means bespoke. It means made specifically for you. Tends to be more expensive, not covered by your insurance. Some people need that if they have reactions to like adhesives or the additives or something, but most people don't. And I always say you shouldn't have to remortgage your house to pay for 40 years of hormones. So I think people, they get led into like, more expensive is better, but you can actually do this pretty darn cheap. I always say pay for your expert. Don't pay for your, don't pay, an arm and a leg for the hormones.
Yeah, and I think that's also really challenging because so many, like the hormone mills, they're doing things like pellets and things like that, right, you're not just paying for the expert, but you're paying a fortune for the therapy as well.
You are. And pellets are the highest dose. They also are a small incision, not a big deal, but a small incision. And again, if you plan on living 40 years past the age of your ovaries, is that a long-term plan? I think some people do better with higher hormones, but most people shouldn't start there. I always say you need to earn your pellet. Don't go from zero to Mount Everest. I actually did an Oprah Daily op-ed on pellets. If anybody wants to go to Oprah Daily and just type in testosterone in the search bar, and you'll get a nice pro and con on a discussion on that.
Wonderful. We will be sure to add a link to that in the show notes. And I want to talk about testosterone because you talk so well in the book and on your podcast about how females have testosterone, but we often forget that or we don't know that. We're never taught that in the first place.
I think we're not taught. I wasn't taught in med school. Does your partner, the urologist, know that? Right? Like we weren't taught that.
Yeah, I think actually he only knew that after. So I actually have seen Dr. Goldstein as a patient. And I think it was only after I saw him and we had those kind of conversations that, I don't think he really realized that before. And I didn't know that either. I'm an anesthesiologist, so it makes a little bit more sense that I didn't know. So I didn't learn anything about sex in my training.
Yeah, right. Airway, breathing, circulation, sex.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I was well into my career when the whole testosterone conversation started, and I've kind of like taken it on. Not that I'm like the national spokesperson for it, but I'm a urologist, and that really helps me in a couple of ways. Number one, I give 10 times the testosterone dose to men every single day, and they do fine. Right. So like I'm used to big doses of testosterone. A woman is 1/10 the dose, right? So it's like, that's nothing. So women make 4 times the amount of testosterone than estrogen when they're cycling, right? Not postmenopause. It's just 10 to 20 times less than what men make. So another way to think about it is like men make a ton of testosterone compared to women. But we make more than estrogen. And here we go around saying like, estrogen's our hormone. It's like, well, in smaller amounts, truthfully. It's the other bias is that we don't have an FDA-approved product at this time. So it kind of perpetuates the myth that it's not for us, that it's unsafe. Right. Insurance doesn't cover it when you don't have an FDA-approved product. So there are a lot of barriers. It's changing. I have that information, right? So so I can tell people it's changing, but we'll see how fast that changes. But I think once we get an FDA-approved product, it's really going to open up the conversation.
Check out the full Bendy Bodies podcast episode on your favorite podcast app.